All right, so now we're going to go ahead and look at another section, and we're going to look now at 1.4. We're going to do half of 1.4 today. Next week, we'll finish up 1.4 and then work on our practice exam, then have our first exam in 2 weeks. And 1.4 has quite a bit of material, and it's very, very important. So we're going to do part of it today. And next week in 1.4, we'll learn about the quadratic formula. So in 1.4 right now, we're going to look at zero factor. And these are nonlinear equations. And here's what we do with zero factor. So we're going to learn about the zero factor property. To use the zero factor property, what we first do is we set to 0. Then we factor. And then we solve each piece to 0. Okay, so we set it to 0, we factor it, and we solve it. We'll start off with some really easy ones, and then we'll progress into some more complicated ones. And we're going to solve this with zero factor. So we want to begin solving this with zero factor. Well, the first thing we need to do is set it to 0. Now, it's already set to 0, so step 1 is already finished. Nothing to do in step 1. What about step 2? Well, this is nonlinear. Remember the difference between linear and nonlinear. This is nonlinear because of the square. It's been set to 0, and we need to factor. Well, what can I factor out of the left-hand side? What do they have in common? They have an x in common, right? So we're going to go ahead now and factor out our x. And what does that leave us with? X plus 5 equaling now 0. Unlike linear equations, nonlinear equations may have more than one answer. So this has been factored down. So now we set each part equal to 0. So what do I mean by each part? Well, here's a part, and here's another part. So we've got two separate answers here. And what are they going to be? Well, the first one is simply x equals 0, because that works with the x that's factored out in front. So x equals 0 is our first solution. So we factor out an x, so we got x equals 0. What about the other one? What is it going to be? Well, it is x plus 5 equals 0. And we need to solve this, so we move that 5 over. And that leaves us then with x equaling a negative 5. So in this case, we have two solutions here. 0, and we have negative 5. This is nonlinear. Anytime it's got a square or a cube or any other power on it, we first set it to 0, and then we factor. This was a very simple one. Now we'll look at some more. So again, these are all going to be solved with zero factor. And let's see if we can remember how to solve this. Let's say we have x squared plus 8x equals about negative 7. So this is going to be another pretty easy question to solve with factoring. And hopefully we've seen factoring in other classes. If you haven't, we'll go over factoring again. Okay, so what do we first need to do? This is nonlinear, so we set it to 0. So I'm going to add that 7. Now we have x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0. If there's no number in front of that x squared, we put a 1 in front. And starting off with an easier one, we'll look at some more complicated ones in a moment. But we'll put that 1 in front, and then we take the first number times the last number. So 1 times 7 is a 7. We're going to put it over here in a box. Now, what we want is we want two numbers that multiply together to give me the 7 in the box here, add together to give me 8 in the middle. So what two numbers would multiply together to give you 7, add together to give you 8? Okay, yep, and I always write the larger one first, 7 and 1, right? Because 7 times 1 is what? 7 in the box. 7 plus 1 is what? 8 in the middle. So you always have to add together to give you the middle, multiply together to give you the number in the box. Now, since there's a 1, we can jump directly to our factors. So this would factor down now into x plus 7, x plus 1. So we factored that down to x plus 7, x plus 1. So it's now been factored. We're now going to get our two solutions. So x plus 7 equals 0. Move that 7 over. And so x equals now a what? Negative 7. So there's that first piece. The next one is x plus 1 equals 0. Move that 1 over. And that gives you x then equals a negative 1. So those are your two solutions here. Next, we'll try a little bit more complicated one. How about we try to solve with zero factor again? About x squared, we'll do a minus. About 16x, and that equals then let's see. How about we have that equals a let me come up with something good that'll work. And I'll pick some more problems from our textbook in a moment. But let's say we use a let's just switch the signs around again. How about we use a positive 17? And this one's going to be just like the last one, except we're going to have to be careful with the signs. So this one has a little bit different signs, and I'll pick some more from our textbook here in a moment. But this one illustrates the signs. So what do we do first? Move that 17 over, and that leaves us then with x squared minus 16x minus 17 equals 0. If there is no number in front of the x squared, what do we put in front with it? A 1. And then we take 1 times a negative 17. Now watch the signs here. 1 times a negative 17 is a negative what? 17. Okay, this one's a little bit different because of the signs. Now, let's think about multiplication. How can we multiply two numbers together to get a negative number? The only way we can get two numbers to multiply together to give you a negative number is one is positive, one is what? Negative. So since this is negative here, you just have to remember our signs. That means one number is positive, one number is negative. Then we look at the sign in the middle. And what's our sign in the middle here? Negative. So the larger number is negative, smaller number is positive. And I made this one very, very easy to factor. And what two numbers are going to work? They're going to multiply together to give you 17. And in this case, subtract to give you 16. What would you use? Negative, yep, negative 17 and a positive what? 1, right? Now, When you multiply a negative 17 times a positive 1, what do you get? Negative 17, right? And minus 17 plus 1, that should give you the negative 16 in the middle. Does that do that for us? Yes, looks like it all matches up. So now we can jump to our factors, which are going to be x minus 17, x plus 1 equals 0. So now we have it factored. Get our two answers, and what are they going to be? Well, they're going to be x minus 17 equals 0. Add your 17. So one solution is x equals what then? Positive 17. And what's our other solution going to be? Yep, negative 1. How do we get that? X plus 1 equals 0. Move that 1 over. So x equals a negative 1. Now I'm going to pick some from the textbook to look at. Once we get the easier ones down with no number in front, then we'll look at ones that have a different coefficient in front. But again, I'm in 1-4 now, so I'll pick a couple problems from our textbook to look at. So let me find a few to look at here. These are going to be zero factor again. And let's look at question 14. This is on page 139. Question 14. This is what we're looking at here. So I'll write it down so we have it, and we'll factor. And factoring is one of the things that just takes a little bit of practice. So if you haven't factored in a while, it'll come back to you pretty quickly. If you haven't seen it before, it won't take long to pick it up either. It's just a matter of mentally working through numbers. So we're on page, again, 139. And we're going to look now at question 14. And again, solve with zero factor. So we've got x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. No number in front of the x squared, so we put a 1 in front. And then we multiply these together. So 1 times a negative 8. What's 1 times a negative 8? Negative 8, so it goes in the box. Now that 8 again in that box is negative. So what does that tell us about our signs? Are they the same or are they going to be different? How can we multiply to get a negative? One positive, one what? Negative. So since this is negative, we have one positive, one negative. Then we look at the sign in the middle here. What's the sign in the middle? Okay, the sign in the middle is what? Positive. So that tells us our largest number is positive, smallest number is negative. What two numbers will multiply together to give you 8, subtract from each other to give you 2? Multiply together to give you 8, subtract together to give you 2. Well, we would use a 4 and a what? 2. Okay. Now, positive here, so that means your larger number is the 4. That's positive. Always use a larger number first. Smaller number is a negative 2. So how does that factor? That factors into x plus 4, x minus 2. Now we can break it down, get our two solutions. So we have x plus 4 equals 0. Move your 4 over. So x equals a negative 4. There's your first solution. What about our other solution? What's our other solution? X minus 2 equals 0. Add your 2. And so then x equals 2. So our two solutions here would be -4 and +2. The next ones that we're going to look at require an extra step. Question 15. This one is a little bit different. So on question 15, we have 5x squared minus 3x equals 2. We're still solving with zero factor, so it has to be set to 0. That's our first step, is to move that 2 over with subtraction. That then leaves us with 5x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0. Now, how is this one different? Well, on all the others, there was no number in front of the x squared. And we could jump directly to our factors, the answers. This one, though, we can't. We have to add an extra step. So we still do the same thing. 5 times a -2. Well, 5 times a -2 is a -10, isn't it? Because we have 5, we just multiply the first and the last together. So 5 times a -2 is a -10. Now we know then that since this is negative, we have one number that's positive, one number that is negative. What's the sign in the middle? Negative. So the larger one is negative, smaller one is positive. What two numbers would multiply together to give you 10? Subtract from each other to give you 3 in the middle. Multiply together to give you 10. Subtract to give you 3. What would you use? Yep, 5 and 2, right? So we need a -5 and a +2. Now, because of that 5 out in front, we have to add an extra step. So this 5 is going to make us do an extra step. Because this is not 0, because of that 5, we have to factor by grouping. And so how do we factor by grouping? Well, we take that middle and we split it up. So we bring down that 5x squared, and we bring down the -2 on the end. Now, what about that -3x? How can we rewrite that -3x? Well, that -3x can be rewritten as a -5x plus 2x, right? Because we could split up that middle. Because what's -5x plus 2x? -3x. So if there's a 5 or a 4 or any number in front of the x squared, we have to factor it by grouping. We can't just jump to our answers. We've got to factor it by grouping. And so we split the middle up into our two numbers. Now we factor it by grouping. What can I factor out of the first two pieces that I've got underlined here in blue? What can I factor out? What do they have in common? They have in common here a 5 and a what? X. So that's going to then leave you then with an x and a minus what? 1. 5x was in common, so I factored it out. What about the last two pieces? What do these have in common? These have in common a 2. So take out your 2, and then what's left over? X minus 1. Are my groupings here the same? Are my parentheses matching up? Yes. So that means those come out as an x minus 1. That comes out. Gone. Gone. And what's left over? 5x plus 2. Now we have it completely factored down. So we can now finish this by solving. So it's already been factored. What would my two equations look like? Well, x minus 1 equals 0. Add your 1. So one solution is x equals 1. There's that piece. What about the second one? It's a little bit more complicated to solve. The second one is 5x plus 2 equals 0. Move that 2 over. And so then 5x equals a negative 2. Divide by your 5. And x then equals a negative 2 fifths. So we now have our two solutions. So we've got x equals 1, and we've got x equals a negative 2 fifths. And these just require a little bit of practice. We're going to do a lot of these. Very, very important that we can factor. So we just did 15. Let's try 16. 16 is 2x squared minus x equals 15. So what do we have to do first? We have to set this equal now to what? 0. Okay, always remember, if it's got a square or a cube or anything else, what do? Set to 0. Always first. So move that 15 over. Now we have 2x squared minus x minus 15 equals 0. We now take our first number times our last number. So 2 times a negative 15 is a negative 30. That goes in our box. This is negative, so what do we know? We know that one number is positive, one number is negative. What's the sign in the middle? Negative. So larger number is negative, smaller number is positive. What two numbers are going to work here? Multiply together to give you that 30. Subtract from each other to give you the 1, because that's just a 1x in the middle. Multiply together to give you 30. Subtract together to give you 1. What would you use? Yep, 5 and 6. Okay, now negative's in the middle, so that means the 6 is negative. It's the larger number. 5 is positive. So now we have our two numbers. Since this 2 is here, we have to split it up. So we've got 2x squared and a negative 15. And how do we split the negative x up? What does that split up into? Negative x splits up into a minus 6x and a positive 5x, doesn't it? You just split the middle up. There's different ways of factoring. I've taught factoring for a long time, and I think this is the absolute easiest way to do it. There's other ways with using a box or a matrix. I've seen it done where you just check and guess the factors. This is a very mechanical way, and I think for most students it's the easiest. So now we look at it. What can we factor out of the first two pieces here? Yep, 2x can come out. And what's left over? X minus 3. Next two pieces, what can come out? 5 comes out. What's left over? X minus 3. These groupings here had better be the same. If these parentheses are not the same, you made a mistake. So always make sure those are the same. Now these are the same, so we can factor them out. So since that x minus 3 is the same in both of these, we can factor it out. They're the same. So we'll put that x minus 3 out in front. Cross it off and cross it off. What's left over? 2x plus what? 5. And that equals 0. Now we can finish it. So we've got x minus 3 equals 0. Add your 3. And x equals 3. You can do these mentally if you want from this step. I like to write them out because a lot of times students make a sign error. I always put all the steps in. If you want to, you can skip a few, but I think you're better off just writing everything out. Math is one of those things, if you make a lot of sign errors, it gets really frustrating. And so you really want to take your time and double check your signs. Students always make mistakes with the signs, or adding and subtracting incorrectly, or multiplying wrong. So it's usually some type of bookkeeping thing, like a clerical error. So always make sure you're careful. What's my next equation going to be? 2x plus 5 equals 0. Move that 5 over with subtraction. So 2x equals a negative 5. Divide by your 2. And that leaves me then with x equaling a negative 5 over 2. And that's going to be your 2 solutions. Try another one. This one's going to be a little bit harder to factor out. Let's look at 18. And we'll just keep working these out until we run out of time. I don't think we'll have enough time to do the square root property, so we'll have to cover that next week. But I do want to do several more of these. Question 18 is a little bit different. So we've got a minus 6x squared plus 7x equals a negative 10. And this one's a little bit different because we never want to start with a negative. And so if it begins with a negative, after we set it to 0, we change all of our signs. We multiply it by a negative. So I begin by working this out. Add that 10. So then we have a negative 6x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0. Now you never want to start with a negative because if you do, it just makes the problem more difficult. So it starts with a negative. So I'm going to multiply through a negative 1. All that does is switch your signs. Doesn't change anything else. Change all of your signs, and that makes it a positive 6x squared, a negative 7x, and a negative 10 equals 0. And this works because 0 doesn't have a sign. And when you multiply negative by 0, it doesn't change it. So you don't ever have to worry about changing the right-hand side because it's equal to 0. Now it's been set to 0. It begins with a positive 6. We can go ahead now and multiply. 6 times a negative 10. 6 times a negative 10 is a negative 60. What do we know about the signs? We know 1 positive, 1 is negative. We look at the sign in the middle. Sign in the middle is negative. That tells us our larger number is negative, smaller number is positive. Now we need to find our 2 factors. Students sometimes struggle with how to find these 2 factors. And here's how I do it. So we've got 60. Now, 60 ends in a 0, and 60 is also an even number. Now, if it ends in a 0, it's got to have a factor of a 5 or a 10 in it. So let's start with 5. So 60 divided by 5. Well, 60 divided by 5 is 5 and what? 12. Does that work for us? Yeah. If it didn't, what would we do? We go up to 10, we go up to 15, and we keep going until we finally find it. So we know that we have 7 and 12. So we need a negative 7 or sorry, not 7 to we need a negative 12 and a positive 5. Let me say it correctly here. Why do we need a negative 12 and a positive 5? Because negative 12 plus 5 is a what? Negative 7 in the middle. And again, because of this 6, you've got to split the middle up. And so we've got a 6x squared here. We have a negative 10, negative 10 on the end. And then what about that negative 7x? How do we split that up? Negative 12x and a positive 5x. Split that middle up, and then we factor. First two pieces, what can we factor out? Can someone tell me? We should be able to factor out what number? Yep, a 6 and also a x. So a 6x comes out. That leaves you then with an x minus 2. Next two pieces, what comes out of here? 5 and a 10, what do they have in common? They have a 5 in common, don't they? So I'm going to factor out that 5. And what does that leave you with? X minus 2. Are my groupings now the same? Yep, they are. So that can come out in front as an x minus 2 out in front. And what's left over? 6x plus 5. Now, what are my two factors going to be? Well, we've got x minus 2 equals 0. Add your 2. And so one solution is x now equals what? X equals a positive 2. Be careful with your signs. It's where students generally will make a mistake, is with the signs. So always be very careful. Take your time. The other equation, 6x plus 5 equals 0. We're going to move that 5 over with subtraction. So 6x equals a negative 5. We'll divide by our 6 here. And that reduces down then into negative 5 over what? Over 6, isn't it? So there's our two solutions. We've got 2, and we've got negative 5/6. Question 21. For question 21, we have a 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 equals 0. Has it already been set to 0? Yep, it has. What do we now do? We take the first times the last. Watch your signs. Positive 4 times a positive 1 makes it a positive what? 4. So since this is positive, what do we know about the signs? We know they are either both positive or they are both negative. Now, what's the sign in the middle? Negative. So in this case, they are both negatives. So what two numbers multiply together to give you 4, add together to give you 4? Multiply together to give you 4, add together to give you 4. What would we use? 2 and 1. 2 and 2. Now, why are they going to be negative? Because the sign in the middle is what? Negative. So we need a negative 2 and a negative 2 here. They can be the same. And that happens sometimes. We still have to factor by grouping now. So we've got our 4x squared, that comes down. We've got our positive 1. And what do we do with the negative 4 in the middle? We split that up into a minus 2x and a minus 2x. Everyone all right so far? Let's see what we're doing. Okay. Now, what can I factor out of the first two pieces? What can come out of here? Yep, 2 and an x can come out. And what's left over? Yep. 4 divided by 2 is 2, so 2x is left over. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and is a negative, so it leaves you with a 2x minus 1. Next two pieces, it begins with a negative. If it begins with a negative, you always want to factor at a negative, so we're going to factor at a negative 1. That's going to switch my signs, and that's going to make that then a positive 2x and a minus 1. Are my parentheses the same? Yes, if they're not the same, you made a mistake. So these are the same. So then a 2x minus 1 comes out, gone and gone. And what's left over? 2x minus 1. Now, what do you notice about these? These are, again, the what? The same. Now, if they are the same, then we only have to solve it once because they're the same. So we're only going to get one solution because those are identical. And what would that one solution be? 2x minus 1 equals 0. Add your 1. And that leaves you then with 2x equals 1. Divide by your 2. And so x now equals 1/2. And I'm going to try to make up one more for us to work through. Just one more, and this will be the last problem. So you'll run out of kind of textbook problems here, so I'll make up one more for us to work through. And again, we're going to solve with 0 factor. Well, we have 4x squared. Let's use a 9 over here. And let me come up the middle here. But we use a minus 16, x in the middle. Okay, just one more, so we have another example. This will be our last problem. Okay, what do we need to do first? Well, we need to set this equal to what? 0. So move that 9 over with subtraction. Then we have 4x squared minus 16x minus 9 equals 0. First times the last. 4 times a negative 9. 4 times a negative 9 is a negative what? 36. And what do we know since it's negative? That tells us one number is positive, one number is negative. What's the sign in the middle? Negative. I made this one pretty easy to find the factors. Can someone tell me what two numbers I'm going to be using here? I'll give you a moment to try it. Once you find the numbers, just tell me. We need two numbers that multiply together to give you 36. Subtract from each other to give you that 16 in the middle. Anyone got the numbers yet? Okay. 18 and 2, right? Because 18 and 2 will work. We can use a negative 18 and a positive 2. Why can we use those two numbers? because negative 18 times 2, what is that? Negative 36. So that checks that piece out. Negative 18 plus 2, what is that? Negative 16, and that matches the middle. So just so we know, here's how we can check. Negative 18 times 2 is a negative 36, so that works. We can also check negative 18 plus 2 is a negative 16. Because of the 4, we've got to do grouping here. And that makes it then 4x squared at the beginning, negative 9 on the end, and what goes in the middle? Minus 18x and a plus 2x. So is everyone okay with that so far? You see how I split it up? And these take a little bit of practice. You may already be good at factoring. If not, just you can practice. There's lots of websites you can look at on how to factor. This is called Factoring Trinomials. I'll post the notes and videos so you can review them again if you need to later as well. What can we factor out of the first two pieces? What can come out? Looks like we can factor out of what? Does anyone know? 2 can come out, and what else? Yep, 2x comes out. That leaves you then with a 2x minus 9. What about the last two pieces? Yeah, if nothing comes out, what do we always take out? 1, right? Nothing comes out, so we can always take out a 1. And that leaves you with a 2x minus 9 as well. Are my groupings now identical? Yes. So what do we write out in front? 2x minus 9 out in front. Gone and gone. What's left over? 2x plus 1. And that equals now what? 0. We can finish this by taking the 2x minus 9 equaling 0. Add your 9. So 2x equals 9. Divide by your 2. And x now equals 9 over 2. There's one solution there. What about the other one? The other solution is 2x plus 1 equals 0. Move that 1 over. So 2x now equals a negative 1. Divide by your 2. And x now equals a negative 1/2, isn't it? So now we have our 2 solutions. Is everyone okay with that? And it'll get easier if you struggle with factoring. Once you do a lot of these, it'll almost become second nature. It just takes a little bit of practice. Now let's talk quickly about our homework. What's our homework? Well, what did we cover? Your homework, we finished up 1.3, so you should be able to do now all of 1.3. 1.4, we got a little bit of it done. We got about a quarter of it done. We'll finish it up next time. For 1.4, you should be able to do 1 through 5. We'll discuss the square root property and the quadratic formula next class period. So that's going to be your homework. Is 1.3 with them all out, and 1.4, 1 through 5. And again, next week we'll finish up 1.4, and then we'll go over some questions on that practice exam as well. Always remember to check your Allen email as I send out these notes and the videos if you want to watch them.